So let me go ahead and get started. I believe you should all be able to see my slides right now. So you might have been wondering, the Gem in We, Workplace Inclusivity. Interesting title, Jocelyn. So it's partially a nod to the fact that a lot of people pronounce it as Gemini. Also, the Gem in We, the collective us, our Gemini locations, across NOIRLab and Aura, and of course, across all of our users. So I'll say it one more time that you can always message Alysha in Whova. She's going to be moderating and helping me answer questions. If you scroll down in Whova, you can message her just by the click of a button. So now that I've convinced you that my pun is valid, I hope that this will spring a series for the future science meetings. So this was Alysha's idea to include a type of talk focused on DEI in these meetings, which I think is great. So you'll see on the left in my slide that we have a raw citrine crystal and a heart-shaped citrine gemstone. They just so happen to be Gemini yellow colored, not sure how that happened. So to use some crystal healing language, right? It's so helpful that you all set your intention for inclusion, right? Towards progress and positivity. But I think we all know that it takes planning and action and skill to refine and cut this type of raw intention crystal into a multifaceted gem. And then, manifest your destiny. So I hope to break down that process of refining for you today and leave you with some gems to take home. So now that I've lost, about half of the audience to that extended metaphor, I'll just remind you that, when you signed up for this meeting, you agreed to a code of conduct. I would say that's a great example of setting a foundation of creating an inclusive environment. And I just wanted to remind everyone before we start today that we want to treat everyone with courtesy, dignity, and respect. And, be free from any form of discrimination and enjoy an environment free from unwelcome behavior so that we can, really grow together and create a nice environment. All right, so who am I? My name is Jocelyn Ferrara. I have she, her, hers pronouns, and I am your devoted Gemini North Science Operations Specialist and Diversity Advocate. So I just finished a night shift yesterday morning, getting data for all of you. So cheers to that, fueled by caffeine. And I am a diversity advocate. So what is a diversity advocate? Well, we have 8 of us distributed across the different Aura centers. That includes NOIRLab, which Gemini is now a part of, Space Telescope Science Institute, and NSO, the National Solar Observatory. All of the diversity advocates are part of the Aura Equity and Inclusion Council that's headed by our Chief Diversity Officer of Aura, Amira McBride. So we collaborate at the Aura level, and then at the NOIRLab level, there's a recently launched DEI task force where employees who volunteered across NOIRLab are working together now on DEI initiatives, and all of the diversity advocates are ex officio members, the NOIRLab ones, that is. Finally, the DAs, diversity advocates, meet monthly with the Gemini and NOIRLab directorate. So we really do have the ear of leadership and a really great structure in place that allows us to work at all different levels and get help at all different levels, right? It's a great network, and we're looking at how we can improve diversity, equity, inclusion at all levels. So what is diversity and equity and inclusion? Well, that's actually the next slide. We're going to get to that later. Sorry. I actually do just want to launch straight into, now that I've told you about my organization and the types of things that we're doing, what types of things are happening at your organization or workplace? So before we even get into any background, let's just go and figure it out right now. So I will have a poll that is launching. Actually, I think it might not show up for a couple minutes, but they will ask you to rate your organization on these two levels across this rubric. So let's just start looking through this rubric before this poll shows up in Whova in about 1 minute. So there's a kind of a spectrum of where you might be in terms of inclusion in your workplace. You might be at the pre-awareness stage where the general population is unaware of bias at all. They don't know it's an issue for diverse groups. It's a very homogenous organization, and that is the norm. People might be saying, in conversation that diversity and excellence are mutually exclusive concepts. You might be there. Diversity awareness is just the beginning, growing awareness that this bias does exist and that diverse groups are negatively impacted by it and are just starting to figure out, well, how do we fix it? So at this point, people, do believe these barriers exist for different groups. And the people who are working on this, it's kind of delegated to the underrepresented minorities and women, right? The people who this bias affects are the ones who are in charge of these initiatives. Finally, there's a transition state before we kind of get into inclusion, where the organizational culture, it's changing. We're getting progress. There's funding, there's leadership supporting it. People are making an effort, but they might be struggling. They might not know exactly what to do. But you're getting towards intentional inclusion, which is where this culture change, right, towards inclusion is embraced, and people are able to accept and articulate on how and why diversity is important. So in discussion, you're intentionally, consciously including how diverse staff members may be affected by a decision. So it's built into the decision-making process, and improving the climate for diverse employees and recruiting and retaining diverse individuals from upper level down to entry level is seen as everybody's responsibility. Finally, this is the standard culture of inclusion. So it's not really thought of as a separate thing to value diversity. You don't need a diversity advocate. You don't need this type of special attention because it's already just woven into the organization. So it is the norm. It's assumed to be part of the way that you operate. So the polls are now open, and I invite you to, rate the general characteristic or the common behavior. And so I separated these out because they can be different. You might be in between two different states that is so normal to think that multiple apply to your workplace. So just try to answer as best as you can. I would say don't go off of what you as an individual feel, but what you see across your organization or institution. And please feel free to direct any questions about this in the chat. Just remember, your response will be anonymous, but it's a great step, a first step to assess where you're at to see where you want to aim towards. So I really love this rubric. It's from Susan Drange Lee of UCLA's Guide to Assessing inclusion in an institution. So her guide has more language about an academic institution. The whole PDF of her self-assessment tool is available to download if you just scroll down in Whova under handouts. I invite you to download that. It goes into much more depth and different dimensions in an organization to assess. So I highly recommend that after the workshop, but we're just going to do these two main temperature points.
Jocelyn, I want to point out that some people are commenting they don't see the poll yet. Is there a way that, is there a publish button in the poll window?
Let me double check, because I do see some results have come through. So it looks like it should be viewable to some. But it is only 3 results, so it is possible that, yeah, okay. I think it is only the admins and speakers who are seeing it right now. So that's right. Let me see if I can quickly just publish one. And then, you know, once I publish, I think maybe I'll push us forward, but that's my apologies. It was just viewable by admins, and we want everyone to be able to answer. And you know what? I think I'm just going to push one through. So we're just going to do general characteristics and common behaviors, just so we can get it. And I am just going to use the rubric headers. So from pre-awareness to diversity awareness. All right. Okay, so hopefully you get prompted and you get a pop-up in your Whova right now. And you can answer now that you've had plenty of time to think about where your workplace sits along this rubric. So I do see the answers coming in. Thank you so much for your patience. I really appreciate that. Just give it a little more time, but it is looking like diversity awareness, the second one, has taken a strong lead. And it's looking like it's coming out as a bell curve with diversity awareness at 52%. Give it a few more seconds. All right. So just to repeat, diversity awareness, right? We're aware of the issue, but we don't know how to fix it. Hopefully I can show you some ways that you yourself can launch this type of initiative in your organization. So the poll will remain open, and I will just continue on here. So the intro to DEI that I teased and then pull back, here it is. So this is just my individual perspective on DEI. So please, there are so many different ways to look at it, but I really kind of see it as a pyramid structure where one builds off the other. So diversity at the bottom of the pyramid is simply the presence of individuals with different identities, perspectives, and experiences. So you are hiring these people. They are part of your workforce. They are invited to the party. And then building on that, once they're there, looking at equity, I would define that as fair and impartial treatment, access, and opportunity. So everyone has equal access to opportunity, to advancement within the organization. Now that they're actually there, there is an acknowledgement of advantages and barriers that people may have. So I would say fair and equal are not actually synonyms. Treating everyone equally is not acknowledging that some have advantages and some have challenges. So to continue that little metaphor, you're asked to contribute to the playlist at the party, right? You have a place at the table. You can contribute to the organization and feel like you have just as much opportunity as anyone else. And finally, inclusion is when all these individuals who, now that they know, okay, I have career opportunities, I can feel comfortable that this is a workplace that values me, taking it to the next level where you're valued for your diverse perspective, identity, and respected for it. There are equitable policies, right, that are allowing you to, okay, take it to this next level and feel like you actually belong there. So you are asked to dance at the party. I have seen this visualized as Venn diagrams with all three, because there are ways that you could have diversity and inclusion, but not equity. So that would kind of look like, okay, I'm hiring diverse people, they feel valued for their perspectives, but they're never going to be a manager. Or equity and inclusion, you have a very homogenous group. Diversity and equity, the culture just doesn't make it to inclusion. There's no sense of belonging. So there's a lot of ways to visualize this. I just see them as building one on top of the other. And I thought that might be a helpful representation because, inclusion is our little point on top, and that's what we're striving to do. So that being said, just because they build on one another doesn't mean we can't work on all three areas simultaneously. Another way that I like to think about, okay, what does DEI touch in an organization? Where can we look to improve? So I think, the bulk of it is in policies and human resources. That's where you really get the D and the E, the diversity and the equity, when it's built into the organization itself. And inclusive culture is our little cherry on top, surrounded by our beautiful NOIRLab logo representation of all the different centers and projects. And then externally, how you engage in your workforce community and with outreach and education also, is an area where DE&I really impacts the quality, the value, the results of these efforts, kind of like, right, your external, your pipeline leading into your internal company. And that also matters. So I'm going to talk about all four of these areas, but I'll focus mostly on inclusive culture because that's why you're here. But I really do want to stress that these other areas matter, and you can find, where you have an impact, like where you want to focus on can be under any of these. So to start with policies and human resources, let's really get into what are these, like, how do you operate that ensures that you have a diverse and equitable workforce? so that you can then have the opportunity to really work on inclusion. So looking at your organization, employee metrics, just keeping track of who is there is the very first step. Who's getting hired every year? Who's leaving? What does it look like when you cross-cut in terms of departments, or who's in middle management, upper management? Just understanding what your organization looks like. If you have a retention problem, if people are leaving that are underrepresented minorities and women, that's just the first step, right? Do we have a problem? Are we, and oh wow, you might get so lucky and say, well, we have inclusion culture, right? We're at the end of the rubric. Great. But you do need to assess it, right? So the very first, going to the diversity level of the pyramid, you really want to look into the hiring process. What is your hiring process like? Are people even getting hired that have a different perspective than the norm of your organization? Where are the job ads posted? What conferences do you go to recruit? Is the language of the job ad inclusive? So these are just questions that you would ask your HR department or ask yourself if you're in that department. And you'll see that I phrase them all as questions because this is just more assessment. It's endless. And there's a lot of work behind all of these questions that we can dive into in more detail if you'd like to. But this is just how are you choosing who's on the hiring committee? Do they have guidelines? Are they given training, like unconscious bias training? And are they given a list of appropriate questions to ask? And are you collecting statistics with each round, right? The applicant pool, who gets an interview, who makes it to the short list, and who gets hired. We gotta get our data to start with. And then once, yeah, I hear an unmute from Alysha. Do we have a comment?
Well, I wanted to bring up a question that seems relevant to this slide. And the question was, how does an organization identify and address barriers without compromising personal privacy, especially when an organization is taking its first steps towards a diverse workforce?
That is a great question. So are you posing this as another question to add to this list? Or would you like me to answer it?
Well, it was from the Q&A, but I kind of thought it was related because I see in this slide some examples of possible barriers, as in barriers can exist in the hiring process itself. So while we're talking about these related things, I wanted to bring up this question so it could be addressed.
Absolutely. So identifying and addressing these barriers, I mean, I would say that this is why I call it under the human resources umbrella, because our HR professionals are, trained to prioritize privacy. So with these metrics and tracking of, applicant pools, they don't necessarily reveal it. And this is something I've seen in Aura too, where you don't want to display too many crosscuts, because it might potentially identify someone. But in terms of personal privacy, there are a lot of ways that you could talk to an HR professional or an ombuds person to start that initiative. And there are people who should be trained specifically in that. I don't know, Alysha, if you had anything to add to that.
So my thoughts about this question so in this question, I get a sense that it's asking, is a person who's already a part of our group somehow suffering by a barrier we have in place, and will addressing that barrier make them feel uncomfortable because we're putting them in the spotlight? Well, what I think about it is trying to anticipate those barriers before and learning how to identify them before that situation happens. So in the hiring process, or even in a job ad, you want to look at it through a different lens, a lens of, are the requirements of this job ad somehow ableist? Do they require the person to be physically abled in some way? And then you have to wonder, is that an absolute necessary functionality of the position that's being filled, right? Another barrier could be the location of the job. Is it absolutely necessary that a successful applicant needs to relocate to fulfill that position or to do their job to its fullest? So those are examples I see just of barriers in the process that could be try to be anticipated before a specific individual has to bring them up and try to address that inequity.
And I'll kind of add, this is more along the line of what I was talking about in terms of how giving avenues to speak up. A common thing is an anonymous survey or an anonymous, Google form, SurveyMonkey. There are mechanisms online where people can submit their concerns. I do understand, though, that if it's a small organization, it could be easily self-identifying. So that is a challenge. But I think, opening up that line and, like Alysha said, anticipating are two ways that I think you could address this. Anyone can respond in the Q&A, I believe. Is that right? Or is it just organizers? I do think that it can kind of turn into a discussion. So feel free as an attendee to chime in with your thoughts in the Q&A and discuss this further. I'll continue on. So once people are hired, in terms of onboarding, how do you support them? How do you help them acclimate to wherever they have moved? Sometimes it's international. This can be very challenging. How do you feel supported by your workplace, your community? How are you establishing the culture and the expectations? Once you're, ready to move on up, who's getting promoted? Is it a clear and transparent process that's decided by a fair and balanced committee? Is it clear what your career ladder is, what your future is? Is it defined? Is DEI a factor in your performance reviews? So in terms of a carrot and a stick, right? If you are someone who is promoting an inclusive environment, are you rewarded for that? Do you have access to promotion? This is definitely under the equity area. Conflict resolution with HR. This is very much under HR. How do you support your employees who make harassment complaints? Are they subject to retaliation? Do you have specific harassment or bullying policies in your organization? Do people feel comfortable coming forward with it? And in terms of more support to staff, do you have resources for supporting accessibility, supporting your caretakers, the mental health of all your employees? And, is leadership communicating and pushing out statements in times of upheaval? Are they taking the time to listen to and support staff? So this is really under the leadership area and the human resources. So these are just questions you can ask. I do understand that not everyone feels like they can affect these areas, but it is just showing the larger picture of the broad influence of DEI. So going to the two external bubbles that I showed you before, how are you engaging with your community? Who's getting your educational materials? Who's getting the benefit of your public outreach efforts? Are your external communications inclusive? What language are they in? How are you pushing out, the benefits of your organization to your community. What commitments or milestones for DEI have been made to funding sources and partners? Like NSF has a broader participation section where there's a statement that has to be made on how you are going to increase participation. So knowing that in your organization and being able to hold them accountable to that is important. What students are getting internships and research experience? How are you ensuring that your data, your output, your product is accessible to an inclusive audience or community? You know, who are you collaborating with? These, I think, are potential future talks in this series about time allocation, you know, our collaborations for Gemini and data accessibility. There are some projects going on in NOIRLab right now that are very interesting about this. And I think that in the future, we can offer some talks on this topic. Okay, so we've made it to inclusive culture. So this is really what you can personally affect, is how I feel. Okay, is there active and widespread employee participation with onboarding, mentoring, internships, outreach, education? Are you volunteering for outreach? Are you paying attention to what students you're giving internships? Are you mentoring people in your organization? And are you supported in that, you know? Do you have the time? Are you given support from your managers and leaders and, you know, rewarded for mentoring and volunteering or not volunteering, right? Do you have a charge code to volunteer? Is your workplace hosting discussions, workshops, trainings, or talks centered around DEI? And is this attendance supported? So some examples that I think are specific to Gemini and NOIRLab are, you know, the hashtag shutdown STEM discussions, town halls, trainings on how to be an ally, the bystander effect, unconscious bias trainings, and informational invited talks from DEI professionals. So this is something that you can organize, right? You can, there's also a DEI journal club in NOIRLab that was organized by a postdoc. So there's, you know, different ways that you can organize a training or even just have a discussion with your own group, with your team, with your department on this. Is it a discussion? If you're at the diversity awareness level, which most of you are, you know, this is just starting, right? This discussion is very important. This is what you can influence. And I think you'll see that, you know, it's very fulfilling to do this type of thing. I will stress that, you know, as I was saying, the previous two sections before are really going to take you through the rubric, right? That's really going to make the organizational change, because not everyone is going to come to your discussions, right? We have 90 participants here. I think there are 500 registered, and that was exactly what I expected, actually. You will only get 20% of people coming to these types of talks. That is the number that I have seen. So it's, you know, great to build that network and find those like-minded people who will help you and support. But to reach that rest of the 80%, I think it really does need to go into policy. So you can still have an impact here, building an inclusive culture. But at the same time, I would liken it to household recycling, where you know that there are a few large companies that are contributing most of the emissions. But that doesn't mean you stop recycling at home, right? That's really how I see it. And then this came up in the rubric, you know, are people other than underrepresented minorities performing this work and serving on committees? So I'd just like to show, you know, our Gemini Observatory working culture. It's made up of treating others as we would like to be treated, striving for personal and institutional growth over status quo, taking responsibility and accountability for our actions, acting with integrity in all we do, having mutual trust in all relationships, nurturing safety of people and equipment in all of our actions, and finally, embracing our diversity and promoting an inclusive environment. I would say that the first 5 items promote an inclusive environment. So it's there, it's built in, but I think, we have to get to the place where it's intentional along the rubric. It does need to be said, because you can default to the norm very easily. So creating and establishing this culture is a high task, but it can be accomplished through asking those types of questions that I just walked you all through, helping, create that culture of inclusion. What else can you have a direct impact on? Well, what are we in right now? Kind of a Zoom meeting. I mean, I guess I'm just talking at you in this workshop, but wow, meetings, right? And if you're doing, a lot of your work, your collaboration in meetings, it's good to think about and establish how to run a meeting inclusively. What are your standards for a meeting? Are you expected to treat with civility, everyone with civility and respect? Do you, pay attention of how much you're speaking or others around you are speaking? Do they get a chance to, or are they, relegated to taking notes every time? That's something to pay attention to. Who's taking the meeting minutes? Who's, given a voice? Who's having a seat at the table? I think with Zoom, it seems like we all have a seat at the table because there's not the conference room layout, but it's still something that when you're leading a meeting or you're in one where not all perspectives are being heard or valued, it's something you can speak up about. Is everyone's time respected? Do you have an agenda? Are you staying on time? We are all, work-life balance is very important, especially for people who are caretakers. Are you scheduling your meetings at a time that's convenient for everyone? And then finally, championing positive atmosphere through inclusive communication. So are you empowered to speak up and intervene in a respectful way? So this is something that Alysha and I developed for NOIRLab. And, I think we started with it as the Gemini inclusive meeting and then broadened it to NOIRLab. So we have it in English, Spanish, and Hawaiian. So this is an example. Please feel free to take this and use it. All of the slides that you see today are available for download on Whova. So I'd like to talk less now and hear from you. So was there anything that resonated with you? And what would you add? Also, would you like to go into depth about anything? Going with the gem metaphor, you have one small drawstring bag of gems for free. Which will you take home? I love those. So I will make a poll where you could respond if you'd like, or please feel free to speak up in the chat. And Alysha, if you see anything now, I would appreciate that. And I will just add a struck gold poll.
So I'd like to point out that someone posted a link in the chat to a resource they have at the UC Davis Physics and Astronomy. They teamed up with their institutional analysis office to administer a climate survey. And they posted a resource about looking more into that. So I encourage everyone to follow that link if they'd like to learn about climate surveys. A brief observation that was made in the chat is that at these diversity, equity, and inclusion centric events or talks, the participation rate is not everything we'd hope it to be. And it sends a message about how the organization or how the meeting or how the conference prioritizes that information. Because I am very pleased to see so many participants in this, and I am very pleased to see that this workshop was given an individual slot in the Gemini science meeting, that it doesn't conflict with a potentially important science talk or result or other workshop. And unfortunately, that isn't common practice at other large meetings. And sometimes a talk like this will be scheduled right alongside with something that will have a much higher draw. So that's also a factor in just elevating the importance of these topics, is to really pay attention to how they're scheduled and make them as easily accessible to everyone as they can be, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, I love that 20%. You know, I'm not trying to say that it's necessarily disappointing, because I mean, I do think that I was stressing earlier, people don't necessarily feel supported in their time to do this. This is a new initiative in NOIRLab to roll out a charge code so everyone can dedicate a certain % of their time to going to these types of events. People, I've been in workplaces where anything fun during the workday or anything that doesn't seem like it's right exactly within like what their functional work is, there are cultures where that's on your own time. Now you have to stay another hour. So it is definitely up to the leadership and the organization to promote that. I would also say something special with observatory operations is that we have a day crew and we have a night crew. So there's always people who are on a different site. There are people who are on a different schedule. So it is also important to schedule either multiple instances or record things so that they're accessible. It's always a challenge in an observatory to get everyone in one place at the same time. It never happens. So, some feedback about any gems or gold. I appreciate someone really enjoyed these suggested questions. I'm so sorry that I just read questions out loud to you for 15 minutes, but it's really where you have to start is hopefully, the answers to a lot of these questions are, I don't need to worry about this. This is in place already, right? But you do need to dissect and understand where you are. And I hope that those questions, lead to actions. I will say it's not a one size fits all type of thing, right? You might have different needs to focus on in your organization. You might have different strategies that people want to focus on. So I hope that just sparks your interest. I'll go on with some unsolicited advice since we're talking about some of the challenges. Just in my experience of being a DA, sometimes you feel like that kitten on the classic hang in there poster. But I think, you need to approach it with a humble perspective, understand that you are trying your best. You are not going to always have the answers, right? And people will not always respond to what you do and say. So you do need to pivot sometimes, right? Stay flexible. I encourage you to assume good intentions with everyone you're working with. I think at the end of the day, everyone wants to think they're a good person. Sometimes they react defensively, but looking beyond that and assuming that everyone does want the best and being patient in your communication is important. And in order to do that, I think having a supportive network is so key. Having a network of people who support you, who you can vent to, who you can ask questions, how would I respond to this, is so essential. I think, this audience, we're not necessarily all DEI professionals, right? So we do need to have resources. Speaking of which, if you scroll down in Whova, I have also, oh, not scroll down, I posted a link as an article in here. I'm not exactly sure where it shows up, but we have a whole Google Drive that has resources, research papers, facilitator guides for DEI activities that you could run yourself. Alysha put it together. I don't know, Alysha, if you wouldn't mind pasting that in the chat. It was posted as an article. It got a few likes on Whova, no big deal. It's definitely here on Whova, but I don't see it under the session exactly. But I think if you go to community and article sharing, it's at the very bottom because I shared it pretty early on. Oh, I think I found it. Okay. So I definitely recommend, diving in there. Yes, there we go.
Yeah.
So please, this is open to anyone with a link. Use these resources. Everything I talked about is built off of this. I also want to urge you, don't forget self-care, take care of yourself. And that, the small victories really do matter. I think there's a paper in that folder about how, cultural buy-in is important. So like I was saying, about how policies really matter because that's how you really ensure that your organization has DEI built into it. That is important, but having that buy-in and people who are just willing participants in this is very important. So anything you do, any of these questions, any one question you ask and maybe build off of for an initiative is amazing. You being here today is great. Even though it's not reaching everyone, it's still so essential. I have, the links in these slides as well, in case you download this later and come back to it. But that is really all I have. So I guess we are kind of at our 10-minute left mark for extended Q&A and chat. And I invite you to, share any thoughts. I do agree you could exchange experiences after the presentation. An organization recognizing work done by its staff would help accelerate change. Yes, so recognition and making it a valued thing is really going to help it gain traction in your workforce. If you get a higher performance review because it's built in as one of the things you're assessed on, is a great carrot. We have it built into our awards at the aura level. And I think we definitely have it at the aura level. One of, at the same level of science and engineering. It's another category that people are recognized for. And this year I went to Janice Harvey, who does a great Journey Through the Universe program at Gemini North and has been reaching local communities for so many years. I forget what year Journey is on, but having that recognized and valued is certainly important. So it's not just your own initiative, it's incentivized.
So Jocelyn, I have a question, and I wanted to know if you could remind us when your office hours were, like if someone wanted to ask you personally about these things, when you'll be available.
So I have at 2:45 Hawaiian time, which is in an hour and 45 minutes after the session, I have some slots available. I know Alysha has some in the following days as well.
Yeah, I am available from Hawaiian time 11:30 until 12 p.m. Hawaiian time, Wednesday and Thursday. And I see a new question that came up that I'd like to address as well. And the question is, what are strategies to help reconcile generational differences in approaches to affecting DE&I change?
That is a great question, because there are differences in how people react to the M word, which is mandatory. You can see that as a generational difference. You might see, the younger generations wanting to just change everything all at once. So strategies for that, I think it's important to make sure that you are getting feedback from all the different generations. Cancel culture, yes, that is real, that is newer. So I've seen this, I've seen organizations where you have kind of like a bimodal distribution. So you have a lot of older retirement age people and then a lot of early career. That kind of says something, right? You didn't retain your mid-career staff. They went elsewhere for opportunities. So looking at that, is also important to see, well, it seems like they were valuing the norm. They were staying with the way of operating of the older generation. So to help reconcile that, I welcome any comments from Alysha, but my thought is to just make sure you get feedback from everyone and try to find, the best approach that honors the desires of everyone, and to not simply just go with one way, right? To have a multifaceted approach.
I think that's really good advice. And honestly, it's just about, it's about bringing a lot of perspectives, right? Is the diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't just this kind of silo of information or issues. So, when I started this work, I found that a lot of people were kind of resistant. When I moved from the United States to Chile, I found a lot of people were not really receiving the information well, or were kind of adverse to it because the perspectives being offered were from a US place. And so we took a lot of steps to try to bring in local perspectives, to try to raise Chilean issues within this framework. So that's, one way you can think about addressing maybe generational issues. Try to zoom in on some of those issues that might be plaguing the generation that's not identifying with these with this information yet, right? There are two questions in the Q&A, and I want to just draw attention to them. There was one that's asked, what is the perspective on the next steps for science collaborations to take to be more inclusive? Lots of collaborations have codes of conduct and leave it at that. But others have done more. It would be great to hear what you think should be the first step after setting up a code of conduct for new science collaboration.
Yeah, I'll think about that. So I know that this is what I was hoping would be a future talk, actually, because Dara Norman is has hired some people to actually look at this question in terms of collaborations and data accessibility. I think having a code of conduct is important for who is established in your collaboration. So in terms of, that's probably the equity portion of it, right? But looking at the diversity and the inclusion, right, is the next step. So I think assessing, who is entering the collaborations in the diversity area is important. And then for the inclusive part, I mean, I think, trying to think about, you know, bringing in possibly other discussions within your collaborations or sharing different resources among that collaboration could be important. You know, having different conversations than just what the next step in your research is. I think that could be a way to build and create an inclusive environment where you are speaking up about different things. That's my 2 cents. I see another question from Jamaica. Thank you, Jamaica. And also thank you, Meg, about, can staff request DEI support for dealing with certain issues? If so, how does one go about that? And mahalo to you. So, I mean, since Jamaica, so at Gemini North specifically, you know, you could always ask for support from me. As a DA, I have gotten requests for, hey, can you host this type of training? Or most recently, you know, hey, can we improve the transparency of like the visa process with international hires? So there are lots of different things that I've tackled because they've been brought up by different staff members. So for this specific example, you know, we have that in place, right? We have me, we have the DAs across NOIRLab, and then on top of that, I'd say in general, there's HR. So, you know, I think HR should be able to support people if you have an ombuds person to just that you just want to express concerns to. That's another great avenue. And it's I just got a notification the next sessions are starting now. It's 1 p.m. If you need to go, you need to go. But I would say, you know, I am here for you. I'm giving this talk to this community and I want to support all of you. So it doesn't end here. The Whova session and the chat and the Q&A I've told is going to last it's going to be up for a month. So you can continue this conversation here in this Whova portal. So please, yes, request support from me. I am here for you. And hopefully, you know, you were able to exit this session with some gems to take with you. And so with that, I will respect your time as outlined in our inclusive meeting culture. And thank you so much for coming. We are the 20%. Thank you so much.